The content of this video was actually originally a part of the whole DoorDash discourse thing, but I realized it was a bit too off topic and probably deserved its own discussion. So let's talk about the minimum wage. I'm sure you all know this, but just for completionist's sake, a minimum wage is, technically speaking, a price floor below which it is illegal for employees to sell their labor. We're gonna have to do a bit of boring economic stuff first though, so let's get going. Here's your basic Econ 101 supply and demand graph. The price of the commodity is on the vertical axis and the quantity is on the horizontal axis, meaning the higher up you go, the more expensive the commodity is, and the more right you go, the amount of the commodity available increases. The demand line represents a relationship between price and availability on the buyer's side. If price is high and quantity is low for a given commodity, buyer demand will be over here, and if quantity is high and price is low, buyer demand will be over here instead. The supply line represents the inverse relationship on the seller's side. The gap between these two lines at any given point basically represents a spot where the buyers and sellers of a commodity have yet to come to an agreement on the price. So, for example, if the buyers want to pay this price for this amount, the sellers will say, no way, it's worth this price at that amount actually. However, both the buyer and the seller have wiggle room. The equilibrium state is where supply and demand naturally meet in the middle, on a specific price to quantity point. This is what the market will naturally bear for a commodity. And by market, I mean the average preferences of all buyers and sellers. Now, there's multiple ways that this point can move. Sometimes it moves naturally. If there's a sudden change in supply, like discovering a new source of a product, or an old source becoming unavailable, or a sudden change in demand, like a product becoming rapidly more or less popular, this equilibrium point will move on its own. Sometimes this is okay, but often it can be used to exploit people. The most obvious example off the top of my head is the scalper phenomenon, where people will buy products at low prices, hoard them until demand skyrockets, and then sell them for significantly higher prices after that equilibrium point has moved. Also, artificial pressures can cause the equilibrium point to move as well. Taxes are a cost of doing business on the supply side, so if you increase taxes, you're actually increasing the price of the commodity, which moves the equilibrium point, generally in such a way that some people who have a demand for the product can't actually fulfill that demand, due to no longer being able to afford it. Here's what this graph looks like in a broken market, where there is no natural equilibrium point, meaning that the price of the product being sold by the supplier at any quantity will never actually reach a point where the consumer will be willing to buy it. There will never be an equilibrium point because the consumers want the product at a price that is so low, the suppliers aren't actually able to cover the cost of creating it. The equilibrium point is actually down here in this example, in the negative price range. It is mathematically possible to have a broken market on the other axis, but this means that the buyers of a product want a negative supply of it, which makes no practical sense. When a market is broken like this, one solid way to fix it is to lower the costs of creating the commodity. If the market is being excessively taxed, cutting taxes is a great way to do this. But if the market's natural state is being broken, which is a possibility, government subsidies to offset the cost of production have the same effect. This is why the idea that the government should never ever interfere with the market is just libertarian cope, frankly. There's good interference and bad interference, and not all markets are the same. This model can be used to analyze anything that can be sold, not just physical goods, but also labor. When you work at a job and exchange your labor for money, your labor becomes a commodity in a sense, and it can be tracked by this graph. The equilibrium point represents what you're willing to sell your labor for, versus how much your boss is willing to pay to buy it. A Marxist would say that because of the inherent power imbalance between the bourgeois and the proletariat, because the worker is forced to work or starve, the natural equilibrium point is basically almost zero on the price axis. Since the alternative for the worker is death, your boss can gradually reduce your wage down below your starvation point even, because it's still better than nothing. In practice though, this doesn't happen, and Marxists are retarded. If a boss were to actually push the wages down that low, other offers would begin to look a lot more tempting, and workers would flock to them. If you were to plot the effects of minimum wage on a supply and demand graph, it would look something like this. What's being said here is that workers who should work for lower than the minimum wage, because their labor just isn't that valuable frankly, are forced by law to sell their labor at a price higher than what it's worth. And employers are forced by law to buy it at that higher price. They simply need to make up the difference elsewhere. Those who want to abolish the minimum wage claim that when employers are forced to buy low-skilled labor for more than it's worth, it's a significant cost for the business. Conventional wisdom says when you increase the cost of creating the product, you increase the price the product is sold at. Labor is a cost, so when you increase the minimum that labor can cost, the price of what that labor produces should also increase accordingly. This is why it's commonly believed that if, for example, you wanted to implement a $15 minimum wage in the US, a whole bunch of businesses that can't afford to pay it would either move elsewhere or just go bankrupt.
I was so caught off guard. We had no type of notice, no type of warning even. The owner had told me Happy Easter.
Employees at Foster Freeze in Lemoore say they're now out of a job.
We had gotten a text in the group chat that
we were shutting down, and I completely thought it was an April Fool's joke.
Turns out he wasn't the only one. Did you guys think that this was an April Fool's joke?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I thought, like, you must be joking. You must be playing with me.
But this was no joke.
By the time I got here, there was people like in uniforms ready to start their day, not knowing that that would be their last check.
Monica Navarro, the former assistant manager, says when she got to the restaurant in the morning, the locks were being changed and employees were handed their final check.
I had walked in and he had just immediately was like, you guys are out of a job, like, I'm sorry.
While we were there at the Foster Freeze restaurant, owner Lauren Wright was walking out. I tried to get a statement. I think he's gonna take off before we even get a chance to talk to him. Excuse me, Lauren? But he quickly drove off. Moments later, I gave him a call.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
He did not answer, but did send a text saying in part, I couldn't survive the mandated wage increases. Last thing I ever wanted was to close down.
It's generally smaller businesses that disproportionately feel these effects, while larger businesses can often just eat the cost. That's okay though, because socialists don't like small business, for reasons I've described in previous videos. When small businesses close, that helps larger businesses monopolize the market. That newly free consumer base will now start to patronize other businesses. And there's also now a new supply of labor, the former workers of those small businesses, that the larger businesses can hoover up for themselves. The businesses that do manage to stay open often have to either let employees go or cut hours in order to make ends meet, which is a phenomenon that was widely reported on back during New York's $15 an hour minimum wage hike in 2019. Increasing the minimum wage now, post-pandemic, as the economy is only just beginning to recover, seems like a terrible idea. This common sense analysis concludes that if minimum wage is increased, workers will lose their job and inflation will go up, leaving the poor in roughly the same position that they started, the middle class feeling the squeeze of their money being worth less, and the rich not really caring because they've got so much money they won't even feel it, as well as most of their value being tied up in property. This logic does make sense, at least on the face of it. All this being said though, scholarly efforts to document the negative effects of the minimum wage have pretty consistently come up with nothing. In fact, a paper aptly titled, Why Does the Minimum Wage Have No Discernible Effect on Employment? Tries to explain why the data isn't lining up with the common sense analysis. The paper outlines multiple ways in which a business can cope with an increased minimum wage. Firstly is by reducing hours. A business can simply reduce the labor time they're purchasing from their workers and demand that they do the same amount of work in less time. This may or may not be successful depending on the job and the workers. Secondly is reducing the benefits. Benefits are avenues of compensation not regulated by minimum wage, and employers might cut them to balance the cost of a minimum wage going up. Third is reducing training. Training a worker is a cost. If they can cut that cost, that can help make up the difference. Fourth is changing their hiring practices to focus on hiring only more skilled labor. If they have to pay more for a worker, they might as well accept only highly qualified workers. Workers with lower qualifications will simply become unhireable. Fifth is higher prices. They'll pass the increased cost of labor onto the consumer. Sixth is titled Improvements in Efficiency. What this seems to be is kind of a rewording of the first point, though focused more on the make workflow more efficient point and less on the give workers less hours point. I would assume that increasing automation also falls into this category. Seventh is the theory that a higher wage would provoke more efficiency from workers all on its own, just as a raise would. Eighth is wage compression, where employers will cut the wages of higher skilled workers in order to make up the difference for having to pay lower skilled workers more. Ninth is simply accepting the reduction in profit. 10th is treating the increased minimum wage as a stimulus, meaning that with more money in the hands of workers, the demand for the products they create should also increase, leading to higher sales. And finally, 11th is the idea that an increased minimum wage leads to reduced turnover. The low-wage labor market faces a huge problem in high turnover, with workers costing money to hire and train. If a worker is less likely to leave a job due to a higher wage, the company may save money on turnover costs. There we go. That is 11 vectors that companies have at their disposal to offset a rise in the minimum wage. Some of these vectors are utilized more than others. There is no evidence that 2, reduction in benefits, 7, increased wage incentivizing workers to be more efficient, and 9, simply accepting less profit, are ever utilized by any business. There's small amounts of evidence that 1, reduction in hours, 3, reduction in training, 5, higher prices, and 6, automation and enforcing more efficient practices are utilized by businesses. There's medium amounts of evidence that 4, hiring only higher skilled people, 8, slashing wages of higher skilled people, and 10, increased consumer demand all happen as a result of an increased minimum wage, and there's a large amount of evidence for 11, reduced turnover. This broadly maps onto my own personal anecdotal experiences. Whenever I was in a low-skilled job and I saw the minimum wage go up, I observed that in the short term, the people around me were way less likely to quit their job now that they were making more money, and they were also way more likely to spend that new money. In the long term, though, I observed automation increasing and prices going up. This is more complicated than the common sense conclusion of workers get fired, prices go up, simple as. And companies do seem to have multiple avenues to spread out the cost of a minimum wage increase. The conclusion of this paper actually agrees with me, saying that employers use a variety of methods to make up the increased cost of a higher minimum wage, and that the reduction of turnover costs, the 11th method, probably constitutes the most effective one, at least in the short term. Moreover, it's important to point out that while a small increase in the minimum wage might not have any real effect on employment in the short term, that says very little about the effects of more than doubling the minimum wage immediately, nor does it say anything about its medium or long-term effects. For example, the data on Ontario's minimum wage increases shows that it did pretty much nothing to slow down job growth in 2019. However, while wage inequality was reduced, there was very little evidence that Ontario's rate of poverty or even its income inequality was affected by the policy, meaning that the gap between the smallest wages and the largest wages shrunk, but the gap between the smallest incomes and the largest incomes remained the same, and poverty was completely unaffected. If increasing the minimum wage is a policy meant to help the working poor, it seems to fail. Additionally, a new study published in 2022 goes against the trend of data showing that increasing the minimum wage doesn't affect job opportunities all that much. They basically claim that the previous gold standard study on the topic from 2010 came to the conclusion that the minimum wage didn't affect employment by classifying the various economic zones they were studying in a specific way. This new study classified them differently and found a robust negative relationship between minimum wages and employment. Now, I don't know personally which method of classification is more correct. I'm a layman on this topic, and you probably shouldn't just choose the one that aligns with the result you want to see. At the same time, this is another piece of evidence to add to the pile. The 10th point in that previous paper, where paying workers more meant more money in their pockets, who will then spend it to buy more products, which means companies make more sales, and they can now afford to hire more people, creating this positive feedback loop. That is the stimulus argument for why the minimum wage should increase, because increasing demand helps the overall economy. But that isn't the argument that progressives tend to rely on. The primary progressive argument for a minimum wage increase is not an empirical one, but a moral one, and is best encapsulated by the concept of the living wage. A living wage is the minimum income necessary for a worker to meet all of their basic needs on 40 hours worth of work. Basic needs means food, housing, clothing, anything that's considered essential to survival. The progressive argument is that if a minimum wage is below the living wage, meaning that it can't meet those needs, then it must be raised. This calculation isn't based on the real-world feasibility of such a policy, but rather the welfare of the worker. It's not hard to find lefties online advocating for a living wage, even if it makes absolutely no sense in the context. For example, this clown thinks that improving mental health at work is simply a matter of paying a living wage. If that were the case, then everyone who makes above a living wage would all be mentally healthy and having the time of their lives. Hell, what is Hassan complaining about? He's making way above the living wage. It's obviously not that simple. Other times, you might find them saying that if a company can't pay a living wage to its workers, that company shouldn't exist. For example, here's someone applying that standard to apps like DoorDash, Grubhub, and Uber. Hold on though, in my DoorDash video, I was told these were essential services, and that underprivileged, food-insecure people rely on them to survive. And now you're telling me these businesses shouldn't exist? I already went over how these services basically operated at a loss for years in order to even get started, and now that loss must be paid back. Are we better off that the services exist and the debt for their existence is paid, or not and not? Sometimes this position is clearly based in ignorance, like this one for example. We need to stop agonizing over paying humans a living wage when these CEOs are getting paid millions. What do CEOs do? The fact that you have to ask that question shows how ignorant you are. A CEO, a chief executive officer, their job is to make major decisions and manage the overall operations and resources of a company. They are a big picture person. In a privately owned company, the owner and CEO will generally be the same person, but in a publicly traded company, the CEO will be an employee, just like any other worker. As I said in another video recently, management and direction is real labor, and it must be paid for, even if you're just a punk kid who hates your boss. Related to this concept is the socialist straw man of the liberal position, that differences in pay are solely based in hard work. Therefore, when a CEO makes 10,000 times the salary of your average worker, clearly the dumb liberal must think he works 10,000 times harder, which of course he doesn't. Checkmate, libtard! But in actuality, differences in pay, especially as you go higher up into the more skilled and specialized areas, is not solely based on how hard you work. That is one variable, and oftentimes if you work harder, you can break through a stagnant period or a plateau or something. But your pay is actually based on how valuable your work is. And there's a whole bunch of factors in there, not just how hard you work. Do you have a rare set of skills? How much did it cost to obtain them? Are you capable of using tools or machines that increase your productive capacity? How many people does your labor serve? That last one's the biggest one, by the way. Here, think about it for a minute. If a dude at the grocery store is stocking shelves and he puts up 500 boxes of product during his shift, his labor has contributed to 500 sales somewhere along the supply chain. If a trucker delivers a load of groceries to the store in the same span of time, and he drops off, let's say, 10,000 boxes, his labor's contributed to 10,000 sales somewhere along the supply chain. It's not that one of them physically worked harder than the other. It's that due to the inherently different nature of their jobs, one of them contributed to other people's lives more. Most jobs are like this, even YouTubing, frankly. There's plenty of YouTubers out there who are more successful than me, they surely make more money than me, and they nonetheless put less effort into their videos than I do. Trust me, I can tell. But because they've got a few more zeros in their view counter, they've got more money in their pocket. Is it equal? No. But is it fair? Sure. They've made more contributions to more people than I have, and that is where the value lies. We're a bit off track here, so I'll loop us back around. All of this stuff gets at the major problem with the living wage idea. It's clear that at least some of the activists are operating on empathy for the poor, but morality alone won't balance the budget. The truth of it is, there is no reason that your work must, in every single possible case, be able to pay for your life expenses, because it's possible that you are consuming more value than you're producing. Other people have to create the food and clothing and housing that you consume, if you're not creating it yourself. If you aren't creating value and contributing to society in some way, why should society create value and contribute it to you? Now I can already hear the objection in my head, beaming through the internet back in time to when I'm actually recording this video. There may be genuinely disabled people who we have an obligation to care for, despite them not being able to give back to the system, because it is the humane thing to do. You won't get any argument from me there, but it's also obvious that there's only so many of these people that any system can bear before its actual productive members stop being able to offset the losses. And with the rise of people who are, frankly, not actually disabled, but they simply don't want to contribute, they only exacerbate the problem. I don't have a concrete solution to the minimum wage thing. I don't know nearly enough about it all. This video is basically just a way for me to figure some things out by working through it, you know? And hey, maybe you found it interesting too. I'll leave you with one final idea. Minimum wage might actually help people at the absolute bottom of the system, at least in the short term, but I think it actually serves to hurt every other person, not just people at the top, but people in the middle as well. The problem is that the idea of hourly wages themselves actually punish people for being good at what they do. Here's an example. Let's say I hire an artist for some artwork for my channel. He tells me it'll take him 10 hours to create. I tell him as his employer, I'll pay him $10 per hour for the job. I know that artwork commissions don't quite work like this, but just come with me on this, okay? So I owe him $100. Now let's say he tells me it took him only 5 hours to make the artwork. So then I pay him half, $50, $10 an hour for the same art. If he tells me it actually took him 20 hours to make it, there was some unexpected snag, then I gotta pay him double, $200 for the same artwork. This shows that as an employer, I value time over money. I don't want to pay double for the same product just because it took longer. Not if I can go to a superior artist and pay half for the same product because it took shorter. Meanwhile, the superior artist is punished for being better at his job. Let's say I can find a truly superior GigaChad artist who can do the whole job in an hour and be on the same quality level. Is what he does really worth $10 considering his skill? Obviously not. Paying by the hour is really good for those who like to stretch out jobs as long as possible, generally the lowest skilled workers among us. Paying by the job is really good for anybody who is at all competent. And paying by the job is also better for employers too. It seems to me that minimum wages, and on some level the idea of a wage at all, exist to protect the people at the very bottom of society. And fair enough, they need protection. But this desire to expand that protection to all of labor doesn't help the actual skilled workers. In fact, it tends to drag them down to the lowest level, which they've spent a ton of time working out of on their own merits. So it seems to me that while the concept of a wage might help the lowest of the low, it only serves to hurt the rest of us.